John Hayes stood in the center of the council chamber and felt the weight of 17 alien gazes pressing down on him. The room was enormous, built to hold representatives from every major species in the galaxy. High above, the domed ceiling showed the stars beyond, a reminder that this council governed thousands of worlds across space. The overseer, a tall Zenthari with blue skin and 4 arms, raised one hand for silence. The murmuring stopped. John knew what was coming. Everyone knew. The vote had been decided weeks ago in private meetings and closed sessions. This public gathering was just theater. Captain John Hayes of Humanity, the overseer began, his voice carrying through the chamber without any visible technology. The council has reviewed all evidence regarding your species. We have considered your arguments and your appeals. The decision is final. John said nothing. He kept his face blank and his hands at his sides. Behind him, in the observation gallery, sat Ambassador Kate Morrison and her diplomatic staff. They had prepared him for this moment. Stay calm. Show dignity. Do not give them an emotional outburst to justify their decision. Humanity is hereby exiled from council space, the overseer continued. You have 6 standard months to remove all human presence from the 5,000 worlds under council jurisdiction. Any human who remains after this deadline will be detained indefinitely. The vote is unanimous. 17 species, 17 votes in favor of exile. The chamber erupted in noise. Some species cheered. Others remained silent. The Kragish delegation, a warrior race that had always viewed humans as weak, stomped their feet in approval. The ancient Velmorn simply watched with their large, dark eyes, showing no emotion at all. John turned and walked out of the chamber. He did not run, he did not argue, he simply left. Kate met him outside, her face tight with controlled anger. She was in her 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. For 20 years, she had worked to build relationships between humanity and the council species. Now all of that work was burning down around her. Unanimous, John said quietly, as they walked down the long corridor toward the human embassy. Even the species we thought were our friends voted against us. They abstained, Kate corrected. They didn't vote for exile, but they didn't vote against it either. They were too afraid to stand with us. What's the difference? We're still out. Kate stopped walking and turned to face him. Around them, alien diplomats and functionaries hurried past, none meeting their eyes. The difference is how we respond. We have 6 months to evacuate 2 million humans from council space. We can fight this, protest it, make them drag us out kicking and screaming, or we can leave with dignity. John stared at her. You want us to just go? After everything we've done for them? Yes, Kate said firmly. We leave quietly. We leave completely. We leave without giving them any excuse to say we were right to exile us, and then we let them discover what it's like without us. Back at the embassy, Kate's staff had already begun working. Maps covered the walls, showing every world where humans lived and worked. Engineers, doctors, teachers, merchants, explorers, families with children born on alien worlds, over 2 million people scattered across thousands of light years. Kate stood at the center of the command room and raised her voice. Listen up. We have 6 months to get every human out of council space. This is not a negotiation. This is not a protest. We are going to leave peacefully, completely, and professionally. We will finish every contract we signed. We will train replacements for every position we hold. We will leave behind everything we built, with detailed instructions on how to maintain it. And we will not complain. Her deputy, a younger woman named Amy Peterson, frowned. Ambassador, some of these people have lived here for decades. They have businesses, friends, lives. We're just going to abandon all of that? Yes, Kate said, because the council has made it clear that we are not wanted. so we will show them what it means to get exactly what they asked for." The next day, Kate sent out the message to every human in Council space. The transmission was simple and direct. "The Council has voted to exile humanity. You have 6 months to leave. Transport will be provided. Finish your work, pack your things, and prepare to go home." The responses came back within hours. Some were angry, some were sad. Some simply asked where to report for pickup, but everyone understood. The Council had spoken. Humanity would leave. On the trading hub of Kelvar Prime, merchant Paul Drake read the message and sat down heavily at his desk. He had spent 15 years building his shipping business. He employed over 300 aliens, maintained routes between 70 systems, and had finally paid off the loans on his warehouses. Now he would have to walk away from all of it. He called his business partner, a Velmorn named Kreshnal, into his office. "You heard?" "I heard," the Velmorn said, his large eyes unblinking. "I voted against this in my local council. Many of us did. But we have no voice in the Galactic Council." Paul nodded. "I need to close the business, but I'm going to do it right. I'll pay everyone a full year's salary. I'll transfer ownership of the warehouses to you. I'll make sure all the contracts are fulfilled before I go." "You don't have to do that," Kreshnal said quietly. "Yes, I do," Paul replied. "Because we're better than this. We're better than they think we are." Across council space, similar conversations happened on world after world. Dr. Mike Chen told his patients he would keep his clinic open until the last day. Engineer Claire Sanderson promised her mining colony that the atmospheric processors would be finished before she left. Teacher Danny White made sure his students would have someone to continue their lessons. Humanity began to pack up their lives and prepare to leave. There were no protests in the streets, no angry speeches, no threats or warnings, just quiet, methodical preparation for departure. Kate watched it all from the embassy and felt pride mixed with sadness. Humanity was showing the galaxy who they really were. Not the emotional, unpredictable troublemakers the Council claimed, but people of dignity and honor who kept their word even when they had been betrayed. The countdown began. 6 months until every human was gone. The Council species watched and waited, some celebrating, some uneasy, none understanding what they had really done. The first transport ships arrived within a week. They came to every world where humans had settled, massive vessels capable of carrying thousands of people and their belongings. Captain Amy Peterson coordinated the entire operation from a command ship that moved constantly between systems. She worked 18-hour days, tracking every human, every family, every single person who needed to get out of Council space before the deadline. Her team built spreadsheets and charts, color-coded by urgency and location. Green meant the person was contacted and ready to leave. Yellow meant they needed help preparing. Red meant they were not responding to messages. Amy hated the red marks on her screens. Each one represented someone who might be left behind if she failed. She sent teams to track down every single red mark, no matter how remote the location. On Kelvar Prime, Paul Drake spent his days working through the painful process of dismantling everything he had built. He met with each of his 300 employees individually, thanking them for their service and handing them payment certificates. Some of his workers cried. Others just stared in confusion. "Why are you paying us for a year?" one young Kragesh asked. "The contract says you only owe us 2 weeks' notice." Paul smiled sadly. "Because you're good people, and you deserve better than this. Take care of yourselves." He transferred the warehouse deeds to Kreshnal, along with detailed records of every route, every contact, every trick he had learned about making the shipping lanes work efficiently. His partner accepted the documents with visible sadness. "The routes will fall apart without you," Kreshnal said. "You know the risks worth taking. You know when to push and when to wait. I can follow the rules, but I don't have your instincts." "You'll figure it out," Paul said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "You're smart. You'll adapt." On Threshold Mining Colony, Claire Sanderson and her engineering team worked around the clock to finish the atmospheric processors they had promised to build. The machines were massive, complex systems that converted the planet's toxic atmosphere into breathable air for the alien colonists. The project was supposed to take another 3 months, but Claire had only 6 weeks before her transport arrived. She pushed her team hard. They worked in shifts, sleeping in the prefab buildings next to the construction site, eating quick meals and going right back to work. The alien supervisors watched in amazement as the humans somehow found ways to cut corners safely, to improvise solutions, to make the impossible happen on schedule. When the processors came online 3 days before Claire's departure, the alien colony administrator approached her with something that looked like shame in his eyes. "You didn't have to finish this," he said. "The contract allowed for delays due to circumstances beyond your control." Claire wiped sweat and dust from her face. "We said we'd build it. We built it. That's how humans work." She spent her last 2 days writing detailed maintenance manuals, training the replacement crew, and triple-checking every system. When she finally boarded the transport, she looked back at the glowing processors and felt satisfaction despite everything. At least the colony would survive. Dr. Mike Chen kept his clinic on Zenthar open until the very last moment. Patients came in every day, some with genuine medical needs, others just to say goodbye. He treated them all with the same care he had always shown. The Zenthari medical establishment sent observers to watch him work, preparing to take over the clinic after he left. They followed protocols precisely, taking detailed notes, asking questions about his techniques, but Mike noticed they never seemed to understand his decision-making process. "Why did you prescribe this treatment?" one observer asked. "The standard protocol says to wait 3 days before intervening." Mike looked at the patient, a young Zenthari with a respiratory infection. "Because if I wait 3 days, the infection will spread to her lungs. I can see the early signs. The protocol is based on average cases, but she's not average." "How can you see what the diagnostic scanner doesn't show?" "Experience," Mike said, "and paying attention to the patient, not just the readings." He left behind all his medical equipment, his entire library of research, and detailed notes on every unusual case he had treated. His replacement was competent and careful, but Mike wondered who would handle the cases that didn't fit the standard protocols. All across Council space, these scenes repeated. Humans finished their work, trained their replacements, organized their affairs, and prepared to leave. Some aliens helped them pack. Others avoided eye contact and hurried past without speaking. A few came to say goodbye and apologize. Kate Morrison worked from the embassy day and night, coordinating the exodus. She received reports from every world, tracking progress, solving problems, making sure no one was forgotten. The job consumed her completely. John Hayes stopped by her office late one evening and found her staring at a map covered in green marks. Almost everyone was accounted for. Only a handful of yellow marks remained, and the red marks had all been resolved. "We're going to make it," John said, sitting down across from her desk. Kate nodded slowly. "Yes. Every human will be out of Council space before the deadline, no one left behind." "The Council species are starting to notice," John continued. "I've been monitoring their communications. Some of them are surprised we're actually leaving without a fight. Others seem nervous about what happens next." "Good," Kate said flatly. "They should be nervous." 3 days before the final deadline, Kate made a broadcast to the entire Council. It was brief and formal. She thanked the Council for the opportunity to work with them. She wished them prosperity and peace. She confirmed that all humans would be withdrawn from Council space by the deadline. No protests, no accusations, no threats, just a simple goodbye. The last transport ships began departing. Paul Drake took one final look at Kelvar Prime as his ship lifted off. The warehouses he had built stood empty below, waiting for someone else to fill them. Claire Sanderson watched Threshold shrink in the view screen, the atmospheric processors glowing in the darkness. Mike Chen recorded a final message to his patients, telling them to take care of themselves and trust their new doctor. On the final day, Kate Morrison stood in the empty embassy. Her staff had already left. The furniture was packed. The walls were bare. She walked through the silent rooms one last time, remembering all the meetings and negotiations that had happened here. She sealed the embassy doors and activated the lockdown. The building's lights went dark. She walked across the landing platform to the waiting shuttle without looking back. The shuttle lifted off and joined the last formation of human ships leaving Council space, 8,000 vessels carrying 2 million people heading for the border corridor. They flew in perfect order, following the designated route exactly. Kate sat in the observation deck and watched the Council's central station disappear behind them. Around her, other humans sat quietly, lost in their own thoughts. Some looked sad, some looked angry, most just looked tired. "We left everything behind," someone said quietly. "We left it clean and working," Kate replied, "with instructions and trained people. We kept our word until the very end." The fleet crossed the border and entered human space. Behind them, Council space stretched vast and empty of human presence. For the first time in 70 years, not a single human remained within Council territory. They had left softly, just as Kate had planned. No drama, no violence, no last-minute speeches. They simply went home. And behind them, in the space they had vacated, silence began to spread. 3 months after the last human ship crossed the border, the problems started small, so small that most people didn't notice at first. On Kelvar Prime, Crescenal sat in Paul's old office and stared at a screen full of shipping schedules that made no sense. The routes were falling behind. Ships that should have arrived days ago were still in transit. Cargo was stacking up in warehouses with nowhere to go. He had followed all of Paul's documented procedures exactly. He had maintained every contract. He had kept all the same routes active, but somehow everything was moving slower than before. The problem, he slowly realized, was that Paul's routes had been based on more than just procedures. Paul had known which captains could be trusted to push their ships a little harder when needed. He had known which stations had officials willing to expedite paperwork for a friendly merchant. He had known when to take a risk on a faster route through dangerous space and when to play it safe. Crescenal knew none of these things. He followed the rules carefully and watched his business slowly drown in delays and missed opportunities. Trade between the sectors Paul had connected began to slow. Other merchants tried to fill the gap, but none of them had Paul's instincts or his willingness to work the impossible hours needed to keep everything flowing smoothly. On Threshold, the atmospheric processors began showing warning indicators, nothing critical, just small anomalies in the output levels. The maintenance crew checked Claire's manuals and followed every step precisely. The warning lights stayed on. They called in specialists from the engineering guild. The specialists ran diagnostics and found nothing wrong. The processors were working exactly as designed. The anomalies were within acceptable parameters. They recommended monitoring the situation and documenting any changes. 2 weeks later, one of the secondary cooling systems failed. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, just a malfunction that reduced efficiency by 15%. The backup systems activated automatically, just as Claire had designed them to do. But the maintenance crew didn't understand why the failure had happened in the first place. They reviewed the maintenance logs and found that Claire had made small adjustments to the cooling system every few weeks, changes not documented in any official manual. She had been compensating for variations in the planet's atmospheric pressure, tweaking the system based on experience and intuition rather than following standard procedures. Without her there to make those adjustments, the system slowly drifted out of optimal performance. It still worked, but not as well as it had under her care. The colony administrator filed a report with the engineering guild and hoped someone could figure out what Claire had been doing. On Zenthar, Dr. Mike's old clinic began experiencing problems that looked like simple bad luck at first. Patient mortality rates in his district increased by 18% over 3 months. The replacement doctor was competent and careful, following all established medical protocols exactly. But the patients who died were the ones Mike had kept alive through unorthodox treatments, the cases that didn't fit standard protocols, the infections that should have been minor but turned serious, the chronic conditions that needed more than just prescribed medications. Mike had seen patterns and symptoms that the diagnostic scanners didn't catch. He had prescribed treatments that weren't technically approved but worked anyway. He had spent extra time with difficult patients, figuring out what they needed through conversation and observation rather than just running tests. His replacement did everything by the book and watched helplessly as patients deteriorated despite receiving technically correct care. The medical board reviewed the cases and found no fault with the treatment. Sometimes patients just died. It was unfortunate but acceptable. John Hayes, now commanding a patrol ship along the human border, monitored council communications and noticed disturbing patterns. Emergency calls were going unanswered more often. Ships in distress were being told to wait for properly authorized rescue vessels instead of having the nearest available ship respond. Colonies with urgent supply needs were being told to follow proper requisition procedures even when people were suffering. The council species had rules for everything, and they followed those rules precisely. But humans had always been the ones who ignored the rules when someone needed immediate help. Human merchants responded to distress calls even when it took them off their routes. Human doctors treated patients who couldn't technically afford care. Human engineers fixed problems whether or not they had official authorization. Without humans around, the rules were being followed perfectly, and people were dying because of it. The Galactic Council received reports about these issues but dismissed them as temporary adjustment problems. Overseer Tarnval held a session to address concerns from several member species. These difficulties are expected during a transition period, he explained calmly. The Council species will adapt to the absence of human presence. We must remember why humanity was exiled. They were unpredictable. They broke protocols constantly. They made decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Yes, their absence creates some short-term challenges, but proper adherence to established procedures is more important than the chaos their flexibility created. The council members nodded in agreement. Order would be restored. The systems would stabilize. Everything would return to normal once everyone adjusted to doing things the proper way. But on Kelvar Prime, shipping delays continued to worsen. Cargo piled up in warehouses. Trade between sectors slowed to a crawl. Kreshnal worked longer hours trying to solve problems that Paul would have handled instinctively. On Threshold, another cooling system began showing anomalies. The maintenance crew followed procedures and hoped nothing critical would fail. They didn't have Claire's talent for seeing problems before they became emergencies. On Zenthar, mortality rates continued to climb slowly. The replacement doctor felt frustrated but didn't know what he was missing. Mike had made the difficult cases look easy, but no one realized how much skill and intuition that had required. Across council space, similar problems multiplied quietly. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that made headlines, just a slow decline in efficiency, a gradual increase in preventable tragedies, a spreading sense that something wasn't quite right anymore. The council species noticed but didn't understand what they were seeing. They blamed bad luck, coincidence, temporary disruption. They couldn't see the pattern because they had never realized how much humans had been holding together in the first place. John showed Kate the reports he had compiled, graphs showing increased response times to emergencies. Statistics on rising mortality rates in areas where human doctors had worked. Economic data showing trade decline in sectors humans had connected. Kate studied the information carefully. How long before they figure it out? Some of them already know, John said. The younger species, the ones who worked directly with humans. They see it. But the council leadership refuses to acknowledge the pattern. They're too proud to admit they made a mistake. "Then we wait," Kate said. "We help any human who needs us, but we don't reach out to the council. We don't offer to fix their problems. They wanted us gone, so we're gone. They need to understand what that really means." In council space, the problems continued to grow, slowly, quietly, like cracks spreading through a foundation, invisible until the structure began to shift. 6 months after the exile, the Kelrath plague appeared on 3 worlds simultaneously. The disease spread faster than anything the council had seen in recorded history. Within the first week, 10,000 people were dead. Within the second week, that number had grown to 50,000. The Galactic Council activated their pandemic response protocols. They quarantined the 3 affected worlds immediately. They assembled their best medical researchers to study the pathogen. They issued guidelines for treatment and prevention. Everything was done according to proper procedures. The death toll reached 1 million in the 3rd week. The Zenthari Medical Research Council analyzed the plague and found similarities to an outbreak from 40 years earlier, something called the Tyrannus virus. That outbreak had killed millions before being contained, but their records showed that human doctors had helped stop the spread by delivering experimental treatments directly to infected populations, ignoring quarantine protocols to save lives. The council scientists noted this historical data, but dismissed it. Humans had been reckless and dangerous. The current situation required careful, methodical research, followed by proper testing and approval procedures. They would develop a cure the right way, even if it took time. The death toll reached 5 million in the 5th week. Lisa Brennan watched the news from her position aboard a human medical supply ship near the border. She had been a merchant in council space before the exile, running a small operation that delivered medical supplies to remote colonies. She knew the affected worlds. She had friends there, aliens who had worked with her and trusted her. Her cargo hold was full of broad-spectrum antivirals and immune boosters. Nothing specifically designed for the Kelrath plague, but treatments that might help slow the infection while the patients' bodies fought back. It wasn't a cure, but it might buy time. She stood on her bridge and stared at the border. She could cross it. She could reach those worlds in 2 days. She could start distributing supplies while the council researchers debated proper procedures. She had done exactly that during the Tyrannus outbreak, ignoring regulations to save lives. But she had been ordered to respect the exile. Humanity would not interfere unless invited. The death toll reached 10 million in the 8th week. Other crises multiplied across council space. A mining accident on Koresh trapped 300 workers underground. The rescue protocols required a specialized team to be assembled and transported from the central training facility. The process would take weeks. Human engineers used to respond immediately with whatever resources were available, digging through rubble and improvising rescue equipment on site. Without humans, the proper procedures were followed. 32 miners died waiting for the authorized rescue team to arrive. The rest were saved, but the delay had cost lives that could have been prevented. A colony ship carrying 2,000 Kragesh families suffered a catastrophic engine failure in deep space. The ship sent out a distress call. The nearest council patrol vessel calculated that a rescue mission would require them to deviate from their assigned route and consume fuel reserves needed to reach their next station. They filed a report and continued on their scheduled path. A human patrol ship would have responded immediately, regulations be damned. But there were no human ships in council space anymore. The colony ship drifted for 3 weeks before an authorized rescue vessel reached them. 40 colonists died when the life support systems failed. The council reviewed the incident and found that all involved parties had followed proper procedures. No one was at fault. Sometimes tragedies happened despite best efforts. Trade disputes that human mediators once resolved through creative compromises now escalated into economic sanctions. Exploration of dangerous sectors halted completely because no one was willing to take the risks that human explorers had routinely accepted. Border skirmishes that humans had diffused through unconventional diplomacy now festered into serious conflicts. The council species began arguing among themselves, unable to find solutions that satisfied everyone's strict requirements. Humans had been able to find middle ground because they operated on principles like fairness and compassion rather than rigid logical frameworks. Without that flexibility, negotiations stalled and relationships deteriorated. The death toll from the Kelrath plague reached 15 million in the 10th week. A young Velmorn counselor named Reshatar watched the crisis unfold with growing horror. He had voted against the human exile, though his vote had carried little weight as a junior representative. Now he saw the consequences of that decision spreading like poison through council space. He reviewed the historical records of the Tyrannus outbreak and saw the pattern clearly. The plague had killed millions until human doctors ignored the protocols and started treating patients aggressively with experimental methods. The council researchers had eventually developed a proper cure, but by then the humans had already contained the worst of the outbreak through sheer reckless courage. Reshatar brought his findings to Overseer Tarnval in a private meeting. He presented the data carefully, showing the parallels between the two outbreaks, demonstrating how human intervention had saved billions of lives 40 years ago. Tarnval listened in silence, then shook his head. "You're suggesting we ask the humans for help. We, who exiled them for being too emotional and unpredictable, should now invite them back to fix our problems? I'm suggesting that people are dying, and we have a solution," Reshatar replied. "Pride should not prevent us from saving lives." "It's not about pride," Tarnval said coldly. "It's about maintaining the integrity of our society. If we admit we need humans every time we face a crisis, we prove that we cannot govern ourselves properly. We will solve this problem using council resources and council procedures. That is final." Reshatar left the meeting feeling sick. He knew what was happening. The council leadership was more concerned with being right than with being effective. They would rather watch millions die than admit they had made a mistake. The death toll reached 20 million in the 14th week. Kate Morrison received a message on a secure channel. It was from Reshatar, sent secretly without council authorization. The message was brief. "We made a mistake. Please, can we talk?" She brought the message to John and her senior staff. They sat in silence for a long moment, each thinking about the millions of lives at stake. "If we go in there without official authorization," John said slowly, "we'll be violating the exile. They could detain our ships and crews." "But if we don't go," Lisa Brennan said quietly, "more people will die. People we could save." Kate stared at the message on her screen. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the council realized what they had lost. But she had not expected it to come at such a terrible cost. "We need an official invitation," she said finally. "Not from a junior counselor, but from the council leadership. We won't force our help on them. They need to ask for it." "They're too proud to ask," John argued. "Then they'll keep dying until pride becomes less important than survival," Kate said. She felt cold saying it, but it was true. "We showed them who we are by leaving with dignity. Now they need to show us who they are by admitting they were wrong." The death toll continued to rise. 22 million, 25 million, 30 million. The Kelrath plague consumed world after world, while the council researchers worked methodically toward a cure that was still months away from completion. And on the border, human ships waited with supplies and expertise that could save millions of lives, if only someone would ask for help. The Kelrath plague death toll reached 35 million before Overseer Tarnval finally fell from power. The vote happened in an emergency session after 3 more Council worlds reported new outbreaks. The member species had lost confidence in his leadership. They removed him not because he was wrong in principle, but because people were dying and he had no solutions. The Council elected Reshatar as the new overseer in a rushed vote that broke a dozen procedural traditions. They needed someone willing to do whatever it took to stop the plague, even if that meant admitting mistakes. Reshatar's first act was to send a formal delegation to human space. He led it himself, traveling on a small diplomatic vessel with representatives from 6 other species. They crossed the border and transmitted a request for permission to meet with human leadership. John Hayes, now an admiral, received them aboard the Constellation. Kate Morrison stood beside him as the alien delegation filed into the conference room. They looked exhausted and desperate. Reshatar's hands shook slightly as he approached. Kate expected speeches about mutual cooperation and careful diplomatic language. Instead, Reshatar spoke simply and directly. "We were wrong to exile you. People are dying because of our pride. We need your help." The room fell silent. Kate looked at the faces of the alien delegates and saw genuine shame there. Not political maneuvering or strategic positioning, just honest acknowledgement of failure. "What do you need?" Kate asked quietly. Within 6 hours, human medical ships began crossing the border. Lisa Brennan led the first convoy, her cargo holds full of supplies she had been stockpiling for weeks. Dr. Mike Chen organized medical teams and briefed them on everything he knew about treating aggressive infections in alien biology. They didn't wait for the Council to provide authorization or arrange logistics, they just went. Mike arrived at the first plague world and immediately ignored every quarantine protocol. He landed his ship in the middle of the worst outbreak zone and started setting up treatment centers. Other doctors protested that he was violating safety procedures. "People are dying right now," Mike said bluntly. "We can follow safety protocols after we stop the bleeding. Get me patients." He worked 18-hour shifts, treating hundreds of infected aliens with aggressive experimental treatments. Some of the treatments worked, some didn't. He adapted constantly, learning what helped and what didn't, sharing information with other human doctors across the affected worlds. The Xanthari medical establishment observed in shock as Mike and his teams brought mortality rates down from 90% to 30% within days. Not through careful research and proper testing, but through trial and error, instinct, and sheer stubborn refusal to watch patients die while waiting for approved solutions. Claire Sanderson led rescue operations to the mining colonies still dealing with trapped workers. She didn't wait for specialized equipment or authorized teams. She brought whatever tools she had and figured out solutions on site. When proper equipment wasn't available, she built it from scrap metal and spare parts. She pulled 40 miners out of a collapsed shaft using a crane she constructed from a broken loader and some cable she found in a storage depot. The Engineering Guild wrote up formal complaints about unauthorized modifications to industrial equipment. She ignored them and moved on to the next emergency. Paul Drake returned to Kelvar Prime and started fixing the shipping routes. He didn't ask permission, he just started sending ships where they needed to go, taking the risks necessary to get critical supplies moving again. Within weeks, the trade networks began flowing smoothly for the first time since his departure. Across Council space, humans rushed toward every crisis and emergency. They broke rules, ignored protocols, took risks that made the Council species uncomfortable. They did exactly what they had always done, the very behavior that had gotten them exiled in the first place, and lives were saved because of it. The Kelrath plague was contained within 3 months. The final death toll was 42 million, a horrifying number, but the Council researchers later estimated that without human intervention, it would have reached 200 million or more. Reshitar stood before the Galactic Council 6 months after inviting the humans back. The chamber was full, every species represented, everyone waiting to hear what he would say. "We exiled humanity for breaking our rules," he began. "We told ourselves we were preserving order, maintaining civilized standards, protecting the integrity of our society, but we were lying to ourselves. We were simply preserving our comfort." He paused and looked around the chamber. "The truth is difficult to accept. We are logical. We are orderly. We are efficient. We follow procedures and maintain proper protocols. These are good qualities. They serve us well in normal circumstances. But when the protocols fail, when the rules provide no answers, when the only solution requires someone to ignore procedure and take action based on instinct and compassion, we freeze. We calculate acceptable losses. We maintain proper procedures while people die because doing the right thing would mean admitting our systems are imperfect. Humans don't have that luxury. They can't watch suffering and call it logical. They can't let people die because the protocol says intervention is too risky. This makes them unpredictable. This makes them chaotic. This makes them absolutely irreplaceable." The chamber remained silent. No one interrupted. No one objected. "We exiled them for being too emotional," Reshitar continued. "We said they cared too much, acted too rashly, took too many risks. But what we called flaws were actually their greatest strengths. They cared enough to break rules when rules failed. They acted when we merely calculated. They risked themselves when we deemed the cost unacceptable. And when they left, we discovered that all the problems we thought they caused were actually problems they were solving. The chaos we blamed them for creating was chaos they were preventing. The instability we saw as their fault was actually our own instability, held together by their willingness to do what we couldn't." Reshitar faced the council directly. "I propose we formally apologize to humanity and invite them to return to council space without conditions or restrictions. Furthermore, I propose we grant them special authorization to override protocols when their judgment says doing so will save lives. We will trust their conscience even when it contradicts our rules." The proposal caused an uproar. Several species objected immediately. The Kragesh delegates stood and argued that this would undermine the entire foundation of council law. Others questioned whether any species should have authority to ignore regulations, but more delegates spoke in favor than against. They had watched humans save millions of lives. They had seen the consequences of pure adherence to protocol. They understood now what they had lost. The vote took 3 days of debate. In the end, 16 species voted to accept humanity back into the council with the proposed terms. Only the Kragesh voted against, their pride still refusing to bend. Admiral John Hayes accepted the apology on behalf of humanity. Kate Morrison negotiated the formal terms of return. She insisted that the authorization to override protocols be clearly defined and documented, ensuring that humans wouldn't face exile again for doing what needed to be done. The human fleet began returning to council space, not as punishment, not as supplicants, but as valued members who had proven their worth through absence. Paul Drake reopened his business on Kelvar Prime. He hired back many of his former employees, including Kreshenal as his partner. The shipping routes resumed their old efficiency within weeks. Claire Sanderson returned to Threshold and checked on the atmospheric processors. She found them struggling but functional, made the adjustments they needed, and trained a maintenance crew on how to think like an engineer instead of just following manuals. Dr. Mike Chen reopened his clinic on Zenthar. His waiting room filled with patients on the first day, many of them aliens who had been waiting months for him to return. His replacement doctor asked to stay on as his assistant, wanting to learn how Mike saw patterns no scanner could detect. Lisa Brennan went back to delivering medical supplies to remote colonies, still ignoring half the regulations about proper transport procedures, still showing up when people needed help, whether or not she had authorization. On his ship, Paul Drake joked to Claire over a communication channel, "We left softly, but they sure heard us when we were gone." Claire smiled at the screen. "They didn't hear us leave. They heard everything collapse without us holding it together." Mike, listening in from his clinic, added his own thought. "They learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is play it safe. Sometimes you need someone crazy enough to care more about doing right than doing things right." The humans settled back into their lives among the council species. They returned to their businesses and clinics and ships. They broke rules when rules needed breaking. They took risks when risks needed taking. They cared too much and acted too rashly and did exactly what humans had always done. And the council species, who had exiled them for these very traits, now understood these traits were exactly what they needed. The galaxy was imperfect and messy and full of situations where the protocol said one thing but conscience said another. Humans had left softly, without threats or warnings. But their absence had resounded loudly enough to shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The silence they left behind had spoken louder than any argument they could have made. The Council would never make the mistake of silencing that voice again.